I agree with my guy Theodosius Dobzhansky, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This is our first video on evolution, video 2.1 on natural selection. Video 2.1 covers these 6 topics. Hit pause for a closer look. Before diving into specifics, it's important to understand what evolution is in a broad sense. The simplest definition of evolution is change over time. We'll add to the complexity of this definition as we go, but for now, change over time is rock solid. But the title of this video isn't evolution, it's natural selection. So how is evolution different than natural selection? Well, natural selection is one way that evolution happens. By the end of this video, you need to be comfortable with that distinction. Now, it's hard to talk about evolution and impossible to talk about natural selection without talking about my guy, Charles Darwin. Many even call Darwin the father of evolution. But what did Darwin do exactly? It's important to understand that Darwin didn't invent or discover evolution. In fact, even before Darwin, scientists understood evolution as an observable pattern. Scientists already knew that living things changed over long periods of time. Darwin's contribution came from explaining the process of evolution. In other words, how evolution happens. And this process of how evolution happens, Darwin called it natural selection. To elaborate a bit, natural selection is when organisms that have favorable traits survive and reproduce more frequently than organisms without those favorable traits. Now, Darwin is really well known for the phrase survival of the fittest, but it's not just survival that makes up natural selection. Natural selection is survival and reproduction. Reproduction is like the prize for surviving. An organism that survives gets to make offspring. Like the name suggests, in natural selection, the conditions of nature select and dictate which traits are favorable. Then, with natural selection, the population evolves. Over time, the population changes, so more organisms in each generation have favorable traits that allow them to survive and reproduce. I want to focus on these 4 key conditions for evolution to occur by natural selection. First is variable characteristics of individuals in a population. Variable characteristics means that individuals can have different characteristics. So not all organisms in the population have the same version of the trait. For example, these butterflies down here have 4 color variations: red, pink, blue, or light blue. So why is variation important for natural selection? Remember, natural selection is all about survival and reproduction. Different variations can affect the chances for survival and reproduction. If an organism has favorable traits, that organism will have the best chance at survival and then the best chance at reproduction. But if all organisms were identical, then all the organisms would have equal chance at survival and reproduction, and their offspring would look exactly the same generation after generation. In other words, there would be no change in the population over time, so no evolution. There are 4 processes that cause variation. I'll introduce them, but we'll learn about each in more detail later this year. First is DNA mutations. Now, a DNA mutation is simply a random error in DNA. Most mutations are neutral and don't result in trait changes, but sometimes mutations create new beneficial variations or new harmful variations. Another process that causes variation is recombination or crossing over in meiosis that's shown down here. Now, meiosis is the process that makes sperm cells and egg cells. In meiosis, maternal and paternal chromosomes line up and they swap pieces, just like this happened here. And this makes mixed chromosomes with bits of the mom's and the dad's DNA. Now, once these sperm and egg cells are made, they're used for reproduction, and variation can really happen when all of these traits are shuffled together. Sexual reproduction creates offspring with new mixes of both parental traits. Finally, gene flow can cause variation. Gene flow is when individuals enter or leave a population, also known as immigration or emigration. Then, the ratios of variations change in the population, or new variations can be introduced, or rare ones can be eliminated as with the individuals that leave the population. The next condition for natural selection is over-reproduction, which means that more offspring are made than can survive in the environment. Over-reproduction creates a huge population, and then as a result, a resource will become limited. The limiting resource may be limited food or space, those are the easiest ones to imagine, but once a limiting resource is in place, the competition is on and not everyone survives. An important term to know is selection pressure. Selection pressure is caused by a limiting resource. The pressure of the limiting resources causes individuals with unfavorable traits to have decreased survival and or reproduction compared to individuals with favorable traits. So you need over-reproduction to create a limiting resource. The limiting resource creates a competition where the best adapted organisms survive and reproduce. Now think about if there was no over-reproduction. With no over-reproduction, there would be no limiting resources. Every organism would get whatever it needs. Then the chance of survival and reproduction would be equal for all organisms. Each generation would be the same as the generation before, so no change and no evolution. The next characteristic is variable fitness of organisms in a population. Now, fitness is an important word in biology with a really specific meaning. The easiest definition of fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. Repeat that over and over again. Fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. A more formal definition of fitness is the contribution one individual makes to the gene pool of future generations relative to others. So, in other words, an organism with more offspring is more fit. Two important points here. First, fitness isn't just survival. What good is survival if an organism can't pass on its successful genes? That's why fitness includes reproduction, too. Second, fit characteristics largely depend on the environment. So, like in cold environments, organisms with high fitness can stay warm, but having a furry coat like this would be a disadvantage in warm environments. In all environments, organisms with camouflage coloring could have higher fitness, but the color of the environment determines what's the most advantageous color for camouflage. So, fit traits depend on the time and place. Now, the condition for natural selection wasn't just fitness, but variable fitness. So, fitness is the abilities to survive and reproduce, but variable fitness means that some organisms are better at surviving and or reproducing than others. So, why do you need that variable fitness for evolution by natural selection? Well, the organisms with the highest fitness will be better at survival and reproduction. They'll make more offspring with traits that had high fitness in the first place. And those favorable traits then accumulate in the population over generation and generation and generation. And what can make this more clear is to consider the opposite scenario. So if organisms all had the same fitness, then the levels of each trait would be stable over time because offspring would be like their parents. And so there'd be no change over time, and again, no evolution. The final condition for natural selection is heredity. Heredity means the ability for parents to pass their traits onto their offspring. The reason heredity is needed for natural selection is that organisms' survival and reproduction depend on the favorable traits that organism has. By heredity, those favorable traits will be passed on to the next generation of offspring. Now, more of the next generation has the favorable traits, and there will be less of the unfavorable traits. And if there wasn't heredity, then the traits an organism used for survival and reproduction would just die with the parent. Favorable traits wouldn't accumulate over time, and the population would just stay stable. If all four conditions are met, variable characteristics, over-reproduction, variable fitness, and heredity, then favorable characteristics will increase in each generation. Unfavorable traits will become less common. Now, because natural conditions are the driving force of the competition, the population adapts over time to the environment. But here's the thing, natural selection depends on the time and place. Let me explain a different way. Here's a famous case of rock pocket mice. Rock pocket mice first lived in deserts with light sand. Light sand made these tan mice more fit. But then the conditions changed so that black volcanic sands were more common in certain places, and now these tan mice were way easier for predators to spot, and dark black colored mice became more fit. A population that was tan at one time and one set of conditions evolved over generations to become mostly black at another time with another set of conditions. So let's recap. Evolution is a pattern of change over time. Natural selection, first described by Darwin, is a process of how evolution is guided by environmental conditions. Natural selection can only happen in a population with variable characteristics and fitness, over-reproduction, and traits passed on through heredity. When those four conditions are met, nature favors some variations over others. The favorable variations accumulate over time as individuals with those characteristics survive and reproduce more frequently.